History said Arab traders built the Swahili coast. DNA proved the real founders were women, and they came from Asia. Along a narrow strip of coastline stretching from Somalia in the north to Mozambique in the south, through Kenya and Tanzania, a civilization emerged roughly 1,000 years ago that would reshape the trade networks of the Indian Ocean world. The Swahili coast, named for the Arabic word for coast, Sahil, became one of the great commercial corridors of the medieval period, connecting the gold and ivory of interior Africa to the markets of Arabia, Persia, India, and eventually China. The stone towns that arose along this coastline, Mombasa, Malindi, Kilwa, Zanzibar, Pate, Lamu, were not merely trading posts. They were cities, with mosques and palaces whose carved coral stone architecture still stands, sophisticated drainage systems that rivaled those of contemporary European cities, and a material culture that blended African, Islamic, and South Asian aesthetic traditions into something entirely its own. Chinese porcelain recovered from Swahili archaeological sites documents trade connections extending to the Song and Ming dynasties. Persian glass, Indian beads, and African gold appear together in the same elite burial contexts, physical evidence of a commercial network of extraordinary geographic reach. The Swahili people and their language became the connective tissue of an entire oceanic trading world, and Swahili itself eventually spread far inland, becoming today one of the most widely spoken languages on the African continent. Used as a lingua franca across a dozen countries. But where did the Swahili people actually come from? This question has been argued with unusual intensity for decades, and for reasons that extend well beyond academic archaeology. The debate had political stakes that shaped how it was conducted and how its conclusions were received. The colonial and post-colonial framing of African history had long positioned the sophisticated stone architecture, the Islamic cultural elements, and the cosmopolitan material culture of the Swahili coast as evidence of external, non-African origin, an interpretation that implicitly diminished the indigenous African contribution to one of East Africa's greatest civilizations, attributing its sophistication to outside influence rather than to internal African development. This framing was not merely academic. It was embedded in colonial administrative attitudes that systematically undervalued African achievement. Scholars who pushed back against this framing emphasized the deep Bantu African roots of Swahili culture, language, and social organization, and argued that the external influences were later additions to a fundamentally African foundation that had its own developmental logic. Both sides had evidence. Both sides had legitimate points. Neither side had DNA. Until 2023, a landmark study published in Nature in 2023, led by researchers from Harvard University, the National Museums of Kenya, and a broad international collaboration, analyzed ancient DNA from 80 individuals recovered from medieval Swahili burial sites across the coast of Kenya and Tanzania. The sites ranged from the 13th to the 15th century CE, the period of the Swahili civilization's greatest florescence. The individuals represented had been buried in mosques and in elite contexts, suggesting they came from the upper levels of Swahili coastal society. And the genetic results they produced were, by any measure, one of the most surprising findings in recent African archaeology. The ancient Swahili individuals showed a genetic profile that was approximately half Bantu African in ancestry. This was consistent with what the African origin school of interpretation had argued. There was a deep, foundational African genetic component in the people who built and led Swahili civilization. But the other half of their ancestry was something that almost nobody had predicted. It was Asian. Specifically, it connected to populations from Persia, from what is today Iran, and to a lesser degree from South Asia, particularly from populations genetically related to communities in modern Gujarat and the broader northwestern Indian subcontinent. The Asian component in these ancient elite Swahili individuals was not a minor signal or a marginal statistical artifact. It was roughly equal in magnitude to the African component in the individuals tested. This alone would have been sufficient to overturn decades of debate. but the study contained a further finding that transformed the entire interpretive framework. When the researchers examined where this Asian ancestry was concentrated, in the maternal mitochondrial lineages or in the paternal Y chromosome lineages, they found a striking asymmetry. The Asian genetic component was heavily concentrated in the maternal line. The mitochondrial DNA of the ancient Swahili individuals pointed toward Asian women as the primary carriers of this ancestry. The Y chromosome data, by contrast, showed a stronger African signal. In plain terms, this means the following. The founding population of the medieval Swahili elite was not primarily the product of African women and Asian male traders intermarrying on the coast. As the standard historical narrative of Arab and Persian merchants settling along the East African coast had always implied. It was the product of Asian women arriving on the African coast and having children with African men. The direction of migration, and crucially the sex of the migrants, was the opposite of what the dominant historical model had assumed. The history books had always imagined the Swahili coast as a place where African populations encountered male Arab and Persian traders who arrived by dhow, established commercial relationships, converted the local population to Islam, and eventually intermarried with African women to produce the mixed ancestry Swahili society. This model placed African women at the receiving end of an external, male-driven process of cultural and demographic change. What the DNA shows is almost precisely the reverse. Asian women, Persian and South Asian, came to the East African coast. They married into or established households with African men. And their descendants, carrying the matrilineal genetic legacy of these Asian founding mothers, alongside the patrilineal genetic legacy of African fathers, built the civilization that the history books attributed primarily to male Arab enterprise. Why would Asian women have made this journey? The Indian Ocean trading world of the medieval period was far more complex and far more gender diverse in its patterns of movement than the simplified male merchant model had ever captured. Persian and Indian trading communities established permanent diaspora settlements across the entire Indian Ocean rim, in Arabia, in East Africa, in Southeast Asia, in China, and these settlements involved families. Not just solitary male traders conducting seasonal commercial voyages. Women traveled with trading families, sometimes as wives and daughters of established merchants, sometimes as founders of new households in distant ports where commercial relationships had matured into permanent settlement. The Persian Gulf communities and the Gujarati trading networks that maintained the most intensive commercial relationships with the East African coast had long traditions of establishing permanent settler communities in trading ports, rather than merely conducting transient commercial visits, and permanent settlement means households, which means women and children and multi-generational community roots. The DNA is now telling us that some of these women, Persian women, South Asian women, came to the East African coast during the formative period of Swahili civilization, settled permanently, married into, or established households with African men, and became the founding mothers of the Swahili elite, whose descendants the 2023 study examined. This finding has implications for how we understand the nature of the Indian Ocean trading world more broadly. The standard narrative has always centered the agency on male merchants making commercial decisions. The genetics suggest that the founding of one of East Africa's greatest civilizations was driven, at least as much by the movement of women, women whose names the historical record never preserved, whose journeys no chronicle described, and whose contribution to the civilization they helped found was invisible until ancient DNA recovered it from the teeth and bones of their descendants. There is a woman living today in Mombasa or in Zanzibar whose maternal mitochondrial DNA traces back not to the African interior, but to a woman who boarded a dhow in the Persian Gulf or in a Gujarati port somewhere around the 10th or 11th century CE and sailed across the Indian Ocean to the East African coast never to return. She cannot know this. The oral traditions of the Swahili coast do not preserve her name or her story. The chronicles written by later Arab travelers, Ibn Battuta, who visited the Swahili coast in the 14th century and left detailed descriptions of its cities and their inhabitants. Describe the coast she helped build, but say nothing about her specifically or about the women like her who preceded his arrival by centuries. The Chinese records of Admiral Zheng, his voyages to the Swahili coast in the early 15th century document the diplomatic and commercial encounters, the giraffes sent as gifts to the Chinese emperor, the porcelain traded for gold, but nothing about the founding women whose genetics tell us arrived generations before Zheng, his fleet ever appeared on the horizon. She exists only in the mitochondrial DNA of her living descendants, a molecular record of a journey made 1,000 years ago that no written source ever thought to record. Preserved only in the biological archive that outlasts every chronicle ever written. The Swahili case is a particularly vivid illustration of something that ancient DNA is demonstrating across culture after culture, civilization after civilization. The historical record was written primarily by men, about men, from the perspective of formal political and commercial institutions that men dominated. It systematically underrepresents the role of women in the founding, building, and sustaining of human civilizations, not because women were absent, but because the people who kept records did not consider their presence worth documenting in the same detail as the movements of merchants, armies, and diplomats. The genetics do not share this bias. Mitochondrial DNA and Y chromosome analysis record maternal and paternal lineages with equal precision, and when they do, they consistently reveal female contributions to human history that the written record overlooked, minimized, or simply failed to notice. The Swahili finding is among the most dramatic examples yet discovered of this systematic historical blind spot being corrected by biological evidence. History is not written in books, it is written in genomes. And the Swahili genome writes a history of founding mothers who crossed an ocean in an era when such crossings required extraordinary courage, who built households and communities on a foreign coast, and who left in their descendants' DNA the only record of their names that now survives. The history books said Arab traders built the Swahili coast. The DNA said something truer and more human. Women built it. And they came from further away and did something more remarkable than anyone had given them credit for.